mercifully brief and just exactly what I wanted. Thank you, Carlton.
My pleasure.
And thank you all for being here this evening. It's been a long day for us all, and including our crew that is supporting this event technologically. And there are many support staff here who are helping with food and drink. So I just want to say a word of appreciation to all the people who make it possible for us to be together. I also want to shout out to a friend of mine whom you haven't met yet, but a local and very esteemed mediator, Nicola Wallace, who lives in Woodstock nearby, gave me a great tour of the Cotswolds yesterday, and who's a leader in the field of mediation here in the UK. So thank you for being here, Nikki. It's good to see you. So we've got a big topic, and just to kind of like pace ourselves, my goal is to be done in 90 minutes and then open the floor for questions. Some of you I know have to leave sooner than that, and that is okay. I realize we are into extra innings now here at this late hour. So as much of this is as useful for you, when you reach your saturation point, that's fine. No hard feelings. Get some dinner and some rest for tomorrow. My goal this evening is to share with you some tools that I've been collecting over the years in learning how to teach this subject. And I will send out, with Ira's help and Carlton's help, a copy of the slides, and there are clickable links on all the materials. I think I've succeeded in putting clickable links for all the materials that you might look at and say, gee, I'd like to try using that with my students or with my colleagues. But first, let me just say a word about my style of teaching. That's Carlton and Ira out there on the ledge. That's me with a spear. And so if anyone feels their needs aren't being met, please just speak up. No, it's actually the opposite of this. I really do want you to raise your hand if something is not clear, or you have a comment that you want to share. One of the things I encourage my students to do, and I encourage us all to do this evening, is to bring beginner's mind to our discussion this evening. It's a Buddhist concept, and basically what it involves is being aware of those judgy parts of our mind. And we all have them. It's one of the things that makes human beings successful, is that we have discernment, we have judgment, but it's an ingrained habit as we go through our day and we say, I like this, I don't like that, that's interesting, I disagree with that. And sometimes that voice overrides what we're listening to. And so I'm going to encourage all of us to kind of let those judgy parts take a little step back. Don't go away, we need them, but bring a little beginner's mind this evening. And also, we're going to be doing some thinking outside the box. Now, I have a cat at home, and like this gentleman, I encourage my cat to never, ever think outside the box. And I have to say, as someone who went to law school, that was kind of the motto of law school, is to never think outside the box. But as a mediator, as a dispute resolver, I've had to relearn some habits. And tonight we're going to talk about a number of things that may be outside the envelope of what you're familiar with. And in particular, we're going to talk about a psychological model called the internal family systems model, which I'll introduce to you in a bit. But that's definitely going to be thinking outside the box. And we should acknowledge that we live in a world in which sometimes people don't want to think outside the box. I love the demographics of this cartoon. It looks like, white male privilege ensconced in some New York club. And this gentleman is saying, I'll start thinking outside the box when the box is empty. Well, for a lot of people in this world, the box is darn near empty or actually empty. And the reason why this topic is so important is that we live in a very broken world in which bias is making it that much harder to heal and mend the things that are broken. Pardon me?
Oh, she sneezed.
I just sneezed.
I'm sorry, I couldn't.
She was just sneezing.
Oh, sneezing, okay. Gesundheit. Yeah. So here's the agenda that I've got planned for this evening. First, I want to talk about my own journey in teaching this subject. Now, you may feel, as I do, that for a straight, white, cisgender male who comes from an upper middle class background and has had all kinds of privilege, one of my friends said that I won the intersectional lottery, and I did. And for me to be in a position of talking with people about this subject, there's a little bit of chutzpah involved in that perhaps, but mainly it's about learning. And I'm here to learn with you this evening. And every time I teach the subject, and it's not just about teaching law students, it's about teaching the whole world. I'm going to give you 7 strategies for understanding and managing implicit bias. I mentioned the internal family systems model. That's a psychological strategy. It's one of the 7, but we're going to spend a bunch of time on it, so I kind of pulled it out of the list. Very briefly, I'm going to share with you 7 strategies for managing institutional bias, because it's not enough, of course, for us to figure out our own biases and figure out the biases of the people that we engage with. We also have to think about our institutions. And finally, I want to share with you some preliminary thoughts. These are thoughts that came to me during the course of this institute about the implications of all this for counteracting anti-Semitism. So, fasten your seatbelts. Here we go. Questions. How many of you have taken a course or training on implicit, that is to say, unconscious bias? Okay, I see several of you. How many of you have taught a course on this subject or training? How many of you have taken an online test known as the implicit association test? Wow, that is great. I see quite a few hands. For those of you who have not, we are actually going to do a sort of version of the implicit association test tonight to kind of examine some of our own associations. How many of you, actually don't raise your hands on this one. Just answer it for yourself, okay? This is a kind of personal question. How many of you have bias of some kind? Yeah, well, you don't have to raise your hands. I think we're going to conclude by the end of the evening, if we haven't already come in here with the belief that we all have bias. And I want to just share with you, before diving into that very subject, 2 principles of pedagogy for me. One of them is that we teach what we want to learn. And that's true whether I'm teaching mediation or legal ethics or collaborative law or diversity issues. And all of us have come to this institute as learners. And I would say especially me, and especially on this topic. So one of the reasons I say especially me is that there are some life experiences that I believe people in this room have had that I've never had. And if you've never seen this video of black parents explaining to their kids how to deal with the police, I encourage you to click on this link. It's about 5 minutes, and it's utterly heartbreaking. And you could go down the list of different kinds of discrimination, different kinds of bias that exist in our world, and create a version of this video. But this one is particularly painful in the United States right now. And to those of you who are not from the United States, I want to apologize in advance that much of what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight is sort of US-centric in certain ways. But I hope it will have applicability outside of that setting. Let me share with you a few things about my personal background so you can decide how big a grain of salt to use in hearing what I have to say. So when I think about my personal background, the first thing for me is family. And this is a kind of odd picture from Christmas because I'm Jewish, and but being a Jewish Santa is fun sometimes, and family is super important to me. I work at a firm called Boston Law Collaborative, and it's a wonderful place. This picture is from a bunch of years ago. We try not to take ourselves too seriously at Boston Law Collaborative, but we take our clients and our work very seriously. Third on my list of important components of my life is that I live in a co-housing community. How many of you have ever heard of co-housing? Wow, I'm impressed. I see several hands. So co-housing is sort of like a cross between a commune and a condominium. Legally, it's organized as a condominium. We all have our own houses, but we have this common house where we have things like yoga and meals and music and meditation and the kind of things that aging hippies do when they decide to live in a collective like this. And it's been an absolutely wonderful way to live. For those of you who think co-housing might be of interest, just type that word into your browser. There are hundreds and hundreds of co-housing communities around the world today. I grew up in the 1960s, and we used to call it the era of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But for teaching purposes, I've had to clean that up a little bit. So I call it the era of rock and roll, political protest, and tikkun olam. Tikkun olam being the Hebrew phrase meaning to heal the world. And that's the iconic picture of my growing up. So I was 18 years old when this march happened. Rabbi Joshua Abraham Joshua Heschel was my rabbi's rabbi. My own rabbi, I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, was a leader of the civil rights movement. My friends and I marched on picket lines in downtown Baltimore to desegregate businesses there. And so I became sort of imprinted on the idea that making the world a better place, particularly in the area of civil rights, civil liberties, anti-war movement, the women's movement, that was the drumbeat of my youth. And it has not, I still hear it. And that's why I'm here. That's why I teach what I teach. That's me back in the early 70s. I took a little digression from graduate school, became a woodworker for 7 years, lived on a commune. That's my daughter Jessica, who is now 48 years old. That's an actual goat, because you have to have goats on a commune, because that's just how you do it. I don't wear bib jeans and flannel shirts quite as much as I used to back in the day, but I'm sort of a plainclothes hippie. Like I dress, undercover in a way. I'm still kind of a hippie at heart, I think. At a certain point, I decided that I wasn't a very good woodworker. I could make a living at it, but it didn't seem like the path that was going to sustain me. And so I stood at a fork in the road trying to decide between becoming a psychotherapist or becoming a lawyer. And I chose law for a variety of practical reasons. But this is the path that beckoned, the path not taken. And what I've discovered is, both in my work as a mediator and in my work in other areas, a lot of that work is done out in this field between these two paths. And I think particularly for the lawyers, this is a neglected area in our study. And I'm trying to remedy that. I'm in a 1-year course of study in the internal family systems model with 32 therapists and me, 33 of us all together, and I feel a little bit out of my depth. It's also a fantastic learning curve. I am part of a group we've called ourselves over the years Five Guys. It's a combination men's group and mediator support group. And it became something more, actually, which is that over the years that we've been meeting, which is, I guess, on to maybe a little over 20 years, we have explored those aspects of our background, including race, including class, including religion, including culture, that have shaped us in a variety of ways. And I show you this picture because I think that for many of us, our various professions and occupations are kind of lonely. We don't often have the opportunity to share in an up-close and personal way the challenges that we face, and not just on issues of diversity, but issues of all kinds. And so I have found this group to be a wonderful opportunity for personal sharing, but also for doing things out in the world, like this workshop that we offered several times when exploring the crossroads of diversity and spirituality. I'm also a teacher and a trainer, and I wanted to show you a picture of two of the groups that I train with, because I'm very fond of them. My colleagues Matt Thompson and Audrey Lee are both with part of Boston Law Collaborative with me, and we've been teaching about implicit bias. Kate and Percy, who are both mental health professionals, Percy's a psychiatrist, Kate's a clinical social worker, we've been doing workshops on the internal family systems model and implicit bias. In other words, digging into the psychology of bias. I wanted to show you these pictures because I think that particularly for me as a white male, I wanted to have a team of people who could bring experiences and perspectives that I lack into the training. And I think that's one way for each of us as we do our work as teachers and trainers can feel a little bit more solid because we are a team and we don't have to take on the full responsibility of understanding, capturing, reflecting the various kinds of difference that are in any training room. So I have a few proposed ground rules for this evening. I do this in all my classes, all my trainings. In fact, in my mediations, I sometimes have to pull out this group of ground rules that I'm going to propose that we adhere to. One is respect. I think that goes without saying. Recognition means if somebody says something, I hope their comment will be responded to in some way so no one feels like their contribution to the discussion dropped like a stone with no ripples. Responsible risk-taking. So we have seen in this institute, at times, people say things that seem challenging or upsetting. They may have an impact on us. I think that what can make an event like this successful, both this evening and the whole institute, is when we think about the impact of what we're saying. It's not just about the intent. And think about how things might land. So risk-taking is good. Doing it responsibly is important. No zingers, right? No personal criticism. I think that too goes without saying. And humor is okay, but not at each other's expense. Are those ground rules acceptable to everyone? Would anyone like to? Yeah, I see thumbs up. You have any additions you'd like to add? Yes.
It would mean that I know how somebody else could possibly understand, and that will result in self-censorship.
Well, thank you. No, I thank you for that point and that question. And because this is being recorded, and I'm not sure if your question was heard, I'll just quickly repeat it, which is, I may not know what the impact is. I can't presume to know the potential impact of every person in this room. And so I'm just going to ask people to, make a reasonable judgment about how something they say might affect someone and to be responsible for that impact. Yes?
Just to clarify, this means that if I think that an opinion I have or a question I have might not be agreeable with other people, I should take a responsible or maybe not ask it or not say it because it might offend someone in the room.
Right. So again, to repeat the question, whether we should self-censor in a way that keeps us from asking the question we want to ask because we fear that it may have an impact, and that could really stifle the conversation. Am I getting it?
No, what I asked.
Yes. Oh.
Exactly what I asked. Should I consider whether or not to ask a question if it might fall wrong on someone's on somebody's ears?
I guess this is great. I'm glad people are raising these questions. My thought about that is that we can present our views in a way that we own them as I statements. Here's my experience. I'm going to share my experience. I'm not presuming to speak for anyone else's experience. And even doing that can sometimes, have an impact. And again, bumping into each other, in these conversations sometimes stirs things up. There's a wonderful negotiation theorist named Mary Parker Follett, and she has this great saying about negotiation and conflict. She says, we shouldn't demonize conflict. All polishing is accomplished by friction. Performing on a violin is accomplished through friction, right? The polishing of a stone is accomplished through friction. But we don't want to destroy the violin, nor do we want to crush the rock. And so somewhere between friction and collision is let me give you one other analogy, and I'd like to then perhaps move on. My co-trainer, Matt Thompson, often says that trainers come into a room and say, I'd like to make this a really safe space. Because if it's a dangerous space, people will shut down and be fearful. And Matt says, I don't agree with that. I think there's somewhere between a safe space, where there's not much learning taking place, because it's all so safe, and the dangerous place that I would call a brave space. So I hope that we will responsibly work in a brave space where we can be clear about our views, speak for ourselves, and be mindful of the effect that we have on other people. Does that seem like an okay way to proceed? Okay. Teaching diversity and implicit bias. There's a story here that I want to tell because it's a story of an academic institution that I dearly love, but I think I'm having kind of a lover's quarrel with it ever since I walked in the door, and it's Harvard Law School. I came in 1981, and I kind of wanted to see what's the big deal about this place, and I thought it would be good for my career. I also thought it would be really hard, which it was. The professors scared me deeply because they had this Socratic style of teaching, and it was just nerve-wracking. And there are some very good things that happen at Harvard Law School. So as I say, I'm having kind of a lover's quarrel with the place. And part of that lover's quarrel arose in a controversy over the shield of Harvard Law School. How many of you are familiar with or know something about the controversy over the shield? Okay, I see a few hands. Let me tell you the story because it may be instructive, cautionary tale, useful in your educational institution. So go back to 1817 when Harvard University created the first law professorship. Where did the $8,000 for that endowment come from? It came from the Isaac Royal family, specifically from Isaac Royal Jr. And his fortune had been made in Antigua. His father, Isaac Royal Sr., was a slave owner, a major slave owner in Antigua. He inherited slaves from his father when his father died. And when Isaac Royal Jr. died, he left land worth about $8,000 to Harvard University to create a law professorship. Harvard accepted the land, sold the land, used the money, and during a celebration of Harvard Law School, I believe it was in 1936, they decided, we should have a coat of arms. We should have a shield. Why don't we use the coat of arms of the family of Isaac Royal? Now, I do not think that in 1936, anybody at Harvard Law School thought about the implications of adopting as the shield of the law school the coat of arms of a slave-owning family. But a few years ago, some students figured out what these sheaves of wheat were all about, and they began a campaign. By the way, this is a family portrait, and I hope you won't mind if I just digress a little bit. I spent some time both at Blenheim Palace and here in the dining hall looking at lots of portraits of dead white guys. And this was Isaac Royal Jr. and his family. And, the clothes are, kind of unfamiliar. But it's easy to look at these portraits with a sense of, okay, well, they were rich, and England has a class system. But we often do not look behind the portrait to see where the wealth came from that bought their fancy clothes and their elaborate palaces. And much of it came from the Caribbean and other colonies where Great Britain enslaved people and created this wealth on the backs of people who had no choice whether to work or not. And Isaac Royall Sr. was known as a particularly vicious slave owner. And so in this campaign that students led at Harvard Law School, they went around the campus, found all the places where there was the shield and put a black tape with an X over it, and this sticker that says, "The slavers of Antigua and the royals burned 77 enslaved people to death in the 1730s. This was during a slave uprising. So the law school was thrown into a bit of crisis over this question of changing the shield, but it became far worse when one evening, it was on a Wednesday evening in November of 2015, someone, it may have been a student, it may have been a group of students, it may have been someone who's not even part of Harvard Law School, took the tape off of the shield and went down the hall of Wasserstein Hall, where there are portraits of all the professors at Harvard Law School, and placed that black tape over the faces of each and every African-American professor at the law school. When I arrived on Thursday to teach, my students were in a state of shock, particularly the African-American students, not only because of this egregious defacing, but it was truly scary. We did not know whether this was a murderous threat, whether the lives of these professors were in danger. And immediately the students sprang into action, took the tape off, and put colored Post-its around each and every portrait of the African-American professors at Harvard Law School. They looked sort of like flowers almost. And look, what's going on here? Huh? When you use computers for stuff, you have to sort of deal with the unexpected. For weeks after this incident, the law school was in turmoil, and one of the things that resulted from this is a takeover of the building. It was reported in the national press, black professors' portraits defaced at Harvard. A movement was born, the Reclaim Harvard Law movement, which grew out of the Change the Shield movement. Both students and faculty participated in the protests. And Wasserstein Hall, where the portraits had appeared, was renamed Belinda Hall and occupied right through the fall semester to the end of the spring semester, 24/7. Belinda was the name of one of the Isaac Royall slaves. As a result of this protest, it was really time to look around and look within. Some of you may have seen this cartoon before. The doctor saying, "That's the racist bone in your body you claimed you didn't have." And fortunately, our dean, Martha Minow, was a spectacular leader through this crisis. And she made it clear that they appointed a committee which decided that the royal sheaves of wheat should be removed. And she said, it's not enough that we reject symbols of injustice, but we must reject injustice itself and redouble our commitment to that effort. So now Harvard Law School is without sheaves of wheat or any other decoration. I think there's some committee somewhere thinking about whether we should have something more elaborate than this. And right in the very center of the campus, a stone was installed with a bronze plaque which says, "In honor of the enslaved whose labor created wealth that made possible the founding of Harvard Law School, may we pursue the highest ideals of law and justice in their memory." So while this was going on, I was teaching a mediation course, and Rabiat Akande, who's from Nigeria, was my teaching assistant. She was a doctoral student. She just got her SJD. And she said, "You know, David, every year we devote a full week of the 12 weeks to teaching about diversity issues in mediation." And she said, in the wake of this crisis over the Shield and the building takeover, you know, you can teach a whole course on that one subject of diversity issues and dispute resolution. And I asked her if she would be willing to teach it with me. She said yes. And so we proposed this course. And I've never seen a proposal for a course accepted so quickly. And Dean Minow said absolutely. And literally within weeks, we had a green light to teach this course, which meant we had to create the course, which was a big challenge. This is a class picture. I limited the enrollment to 24 students. We've had a very long waiting list every single year that I've been teaching the course. There's Rabiat Akande. This is our guest speaker, Tricia Elam Walker, and her husband, Chuck Walker. And it was an intense learning experience and wonderful learning experience for all of us. If you want to look at the syllabus for the course, I've got a clickable link here, and you can look at the design of the course if it's of interest. The necessary ingredient, especially for me, was humility and the readiness to learn from students who had had experiences that I've never had and probably never will have. This is the course in a nutshell. You'll see that implicit bias occupies day 4. There's also on day 5, it's consecutive days during the January winter term. We talk about the psychology. So what I'm going to be covering here tonight is mainly these 2 days of the course, just a little bit about the intro to get us to implicit bias. So the first thing we do is we talk about difficult conversations, because this is an inherently difficult subject to talk about. I think we can probably all agree on that. And there's this wonderful book, some of you may know of it, called Difficult Conversations, which talks about how when we're having a difficult conversation, we can break it down into the what happened, conversation, feelings, identity, and so forth. And the key element is distinguishing impact from intent. We speak for the impact on us, the I statement. Characterizing other people's intent is an inherently hazardous activity, in my experience. On the second day, we watch a TED Talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, which is an amazing talk. How many of you have heard her talk on the danger of a single story? Yeah. Fabulous talk. And basically about how until we get to know each other, we often just have one idea about who the other person is, one characteristic. And it's basically an encouragement for all of us to get into a richer state of knowledge and experience and connection with people. I mention this grasshopper story because it sort of sums up the whole lesson of this day of the course in a few words. So to tell the story, it's about a bar and a grasshopper who finds her way into a bar and hops up on a bar stool. Now, the first thing you have to know, I'm not much of a drinker, but there's a mixed drink called a grasshopper. I think it has creme de menthe and maybe some other things in it. I think my parents used to drink grasshoppers. I've never had one. But it's something that's known in bars. And the bartender looks down and sees a grasshopper sitting on top of the bar stool and says, "Wow, we've got a drink named after you." And the grasshopper looks up and says, "Why would someone name a drink Christine?" And And I just love that story because it sort of reflects the gap between, on the one hand, how we see others and how others see themselves. So we listened to this wonderful TED Talk. We also listened to Kim Crenshaw talk about intersectionality. This too is a great TED Talk. She was one of my law school classmates, and she was one of the activists back in the day when we were in law school. She's a wonderful colleague. And intersectionality, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, is also a challenge to the idea of the single story. It complexifies the sense of who we are and who others are. And as the homework for this day of the course, I asked the students to write a brief essay about themselves. And they can talk about an area of interest or activity that they're passionate about, or a person in their life that influenced them, or an experience or aspect of their background that shaped the person you became, or any other aspect of your life up to this point that seems salient. And I asked them to include only information you'd be comfortable sharing, in a small group discussion in class. And the students write amazing essays. They are just extraordinary, talking about ways in which they are different. One of my students this past year talked about how she is an HSP. I had never heard the term HSP. Stands for highly sensitive person. And she has a sensitivity to sound, to light, to smell, to other things. And I'm not an expert on this at all. Someone here might know far more than I do. Other people talked about growing up, having to keep a secret about their sexual orientation or about other aspects of their identity. So a huge amount of personal sharing happened on day 2 of the course and set the stage for some other deeper learnings and sharings that took place through the rest of the course. So here's an exercise that we do during the course. Some people call it a social identity circle. Some people call it Who's Here. And I'll describe it, and I'll show you a quick video of it. It basically involves people standing in a circle, and one person will call out an identity, like, please step into the circle if you're adopted. And when I did this exercise once, someone said that, an adoptee, and no one else stepped in the circle. And others of us standing outside the circle felt a little bad. And so the next comment, next identity, someone said, please step into the circle if you're in a family that includes adoptees. And then a bunch of people stepped in, looked around. And it's a lovely exercise because, again, you're seeing people more three-dimensionally and getting to feel a sense of safety. So these are the instructions if you look at the slides and you want to use this exercise. Here's the kinds of things that we use for a debrief. But let me show you a video. Now this is not exactly like how it's done in the class, because in the class people call out their own identities. In this one you'll hear an announcer doing it.
It's easy to put people in boxes. There's us, and there's them.
This was made for Danish public television.
The high earners, and those just getting by. Those we trust, and those we try to avoid. There's the new Danes, and those who've always been here. The people from the countryside, and those who've never seen a cow. The religious, and the self-confident. There are those we share something with, and those we don't share anything with.
Velkommen. Jeg kommer til at stille jer nogle spørgsmål i dag.
I'm going to ask you some questions
Det kan godt være
today.
lidt,
Some of them might be a bit personal,
men jeg håber, I vil svare ærligt på dem.
but I hope you'll answer them honestly.
Hvem herinde i rummet var klassens klovn?
Who is the class clown?
Hvem er bonusforældre?
Who are step parents?
And then suddenly, there's us. We who believe in life after death. We who've seen UFOs. And all of us who love to dance. We who've been bullied. And we who've bullied others. And then there's us, the lucky ones who've had sex this past week. We who are broken-hearted. We who are madly in love. We who feel lonely. We who are bisexual. And we who acknowledge the courage of others. We who have found the meaning of life. And we who have saved lives. And then there's all of us who just love Denmark. So maybe there's more that brings us together than we think. TV2 Denmark.
So I guess it's a little bit of a public service announcement in a way. And it's, as I said, not the way we do the exercise in the course, but it'll give you kind of a flavor of the impact. A second exercise that we do a little later in the course is called a stereotyping exercise. We don't have time to do it here tonight, but how many of you have ever heard of it or done it, stereotyping exercise? Yep. So it was created by the Public Conversations Project. Maybe there are other versions out there that are being used. And basically what it asks people to do is to say, as a blank, I think I'm viewed by certain other people as having these characteristics, beliefs, or intentions. So as a lawyer, I think that I am sometimes viewed by people who are not lawyers as being, I don't know, arrogant or greedy or argumentative or, you know, or as a person who lives in a co-housing community, I think I'm maybe viewed as a crunchy granola tree hugger who uses crystals, bells, and drumming in some kind of cult ritual every evening. And that's only partially true. And I did bring my bell, so at various times we'll, you know, summon the group back together with the bell. And sometimes people will talk about as a white person or as a black person, as a man, as a woman, as someone who's in the LGBTQ community or some other identity. People are encouraged to talk in small groups and share only those stereotypes that they feel comfortable sharing. And I've been impressed by how much sharing people are willing to do. I think this exercise is quite useful on the road to learning about implicit bias for this reason. Once we can acknowledge and think about the ways we have been stereotyped, it helps open the door to realizing that we may stereotype others. And I think that's a critical step in terms of our awareness. So these are the instructions. You can download the exercise itself here. It's not copyright protected. They actually, the organization wants people to use it. Discussion of stereotyping, of course, leads to a discussion of microaggressions, which has become a term that we're more familiar with now than at one time. And I think everyone here knows what we mean when we say microaggressions. They might be intentional or unintentional, based on any number of factors. And I thought I'd share with you a very brief, I think it's an MTV video, about what if microaggressions happen to white people. It's kind of short and kind of funny. Let's get it to full size here.
You're not good at golf. white. People of color have to deal with racial microaggressions every single day. So microaggressions are those little unintentional insults that basically see people of color as stereotypes. Which got me thinking, what if white people had to deal with racial microaggressions?
So like, where are you from?
No, like, where are you really from?
Why don't you have an accent? Like a Swedish accent.
You know, your English is really, really good. It's like I can't even tell you have an accent or anything.
I don't have an accent.
No, that's what I'm saying.
You don't speak Gaelic?
You don't speak German?
Can you say a curse word European?
You know, like, what does that even mean?
Hey Connor, you know about NASCAR stuff, right? Can you take a look at this?
Can you teach me how to line dance?
Play the banjo?
Act entitled in the supermarket.
Love white food. No real flavor to it. Never an upset tummy. You're so exotic.
How do you get your hair like that? I love how it's so limp. Ew, why does it feel like that? Oh my god, so it just does that? No, you are really pretty for a white girl.
Your eyes are so round, like this.
You know who you look like? Kenny Chesney. Zach Braff.
Emma Stone.
Rachel Maddow.
My friend Chad. Maybe you know him, 'cause he's white too.
No, Emma Watson.
Not that little more. What's the other guy?
Is it Emma Thompson?
It's C-H-A-D, like Chad.
One of the Emmas. You look like an Emma.
You know who you look like? I bet you hear this all the time. Jeffrey Dahmer. How does it feel to be the token white guy? Hey, Connor, can we get a white perspective on this? I love everything about white culture. You guys are like so fun. What do you mean you don't listen to Creed? You're white.
You've never tried that. But you're white.
You don't act like a normal white person.
You're not really white though.
You're not really white. I'm whiter than you are.
So, did all your ancestors own slaves?
No, but of course he wishes that he could still own slaves. That's a part of his culture.
Bryce, back me up on this one. The thing you have to understand about white
No,
culture
I
is
went
that
to
white
an
people are...
historically white college, so
Okay,
I know about
I
white culture.
backpacked in Europe. So can you say how ridiculous this was? I know. Story of my life. If you've ever experienced microaggressions because of your race, gender, sexuality, or body type, go ahead and vent about it in the comments.
Can you teach me how to like take a really popular rap song and like make it a ukulele song? It's so cool. I think it's so cool how you guys do that.
Okay, enough frivolity, but it's not actually frivolous. It's actually a serious thing and a daily experience, depending on what, how people see you. Okay, so let's dive into the 7 strategies. The first one is raising awareness of bias as a universal phenomenon. And the tenets that I would offer you on that point, I don't think they're controversial actually, but if you think they are, please feel free to say so, is the idea that bias is ubiquitous, it's part of the human condition. Not all biases are bad. I'm going to show you in just a moment a good bias having to do with lions. Unconscious bias is malleable, it's measurable, and if you take the implicit association test, which you can click on here, you can find out more about your own associations. So let's go to a classroom at Google. This is a gentleman, psychologist, Brian Welly, who has been traveling around the various Google offices with other psychologists teaching about unconscious bias because Google was trying to remedy the problem that their workforce did not come even anywhere near reflecting the population. And so here's Brian talking about bias.
And this beginning is hundreds of thousands of years ago. Right, so this is us when we were new species and we were living in hunter-gatherer societies. We were huddled together in caves. We're making really pretty paintings. But the world was different back then. A lot of the decisions that were made on a daily basis were life and death decisions. So now imagine that you were in the society and you were determined to be completely unbiased. And so you leave your cave and you're going to walk through the savannah, you're going to look for food, and you're like, I am not going to make a biased decision today. And then you see an animal. It's like, I'm not going to make a conclusion about that animal. Let me consciously process everything that I see here. It has 4 legs. It has fur, so I'm going to conclude a mammal. And it's got sharp teeth, so I'm going to say it's a predator. And it doesn't really fit my prototype for a dog or any of that. I think it's in the cat family. And yes, I think it's going to be a lion. And then you make the decision that you should probably run. Well, that set of unbiased decisions will lead us here, which is we're going to be meat for that line, right? So the point I'm trying to make here is that when we talk about bias, it's sometimes with this view that all of the ways that we make shortcuts in decision making and how we perceive the world is actually bad. And it's not. And in fact, in a lot of ways, it's very good and very functional, and without these shortcuts, we would not get through the day. But when it comes to people decisions, it sometimes steers us clear. Now, the world we're living in today is not filled with life and death decisions on a daily basis like it was back then, but in a lot of ways, it's a lot more complicated. So we're all in New York City. We're surrounded by literally millions of people going about their business. Even crossing the street requires algorithms. Like, we're looking at the person coming to us. Are they going to veer right? Are they going to veer left? Do I have this much distance? I am entering the train and I see one car with nobody in it, and I see another car where that's just packed to the gills. Which one are you going to take? Now, logic would assume that you would go into the car with a lot of standing room, but we all know, given our experience, that we should probably avoid that car, right? So those are the kinds of decisions we're making. And bias is what's helping us make that, right? So sometimes it's good, and in fact it's essential. Every single moment, and by the moment I'm not meaning days here or a week, I'm talking seconds, we are inundated with 11 million bits of information. And yet, consciously, we are only capable of processing 40 bits of information. So that delta from 11 million bits to 40 bits is covered by our unconscious. All of these amazingly complex heuristics and algorithms that are helping us get through the day. Absolutely fascinating. And yet now...
So there's obviously a lot more you can see. It's an hour-long lecture and worthwhile. But the point here is that we are receiving data about our environment, people that we're encountering all the time, and 40 bits per second we can consciously process. Some estimates of that are actually a little bit lower than 40, but in any event, my colleague Percy Ballard, the psychiatrist, says that it's a little bit like having Alexa on board, and because we're taking in all the sounds and all the information, and who knows what Amazon is doing with it. They say they delete it, but it's being at least temporarily recorded. So the first thing to understand is that some biases help us cross the street. Some biases help us figure out what to eat, how much to eat, so forth. Apropos crossing the street, I have a bias that when I come up to the curb and I'm about to cross the street, that I should look to the left, because that's where the cars are coming from. And I almost got hit by the proverbial bus out here on whatever street is in front of St. John's, because no, the bus was coming from the other direction. And so that bias didn't work so well for me, and I have to kind of relearn that one when I'm in the UK. Here's Project Implicit. As you can see, there are many, many, many different tests that you can take using it. It was created by Tony Greenwald and Professor Mahzarin Banaji, she's the head of the psychology department at Harvard University. This is what a screen looks like in the implicit association test. You're asked to make these various associations. Her book, the book she wrote with Tony Greenwald, Blind Spot, is a very good explanation of how they arrived at this technology. And this is another video, which I think it's worth the time to listen to it. It was made by the American Bar Association, and it was made for judges. And the reason why I think it's so remarkable is because you'll hear the judges in just a moment talk about their bias. Now, there is one group of people in our society, at least one, whose job description is to be unbiased, right? That others of us, maybe don't have to take that pledge, but they definitely have to take that pledge. And let's see what they have to say about their biases.
Justice is not blind. People begin their judgment even before they start to think about an individual case.
85% of Americans say that they have no bias, but that's not true.
This is not about people being bad. This is about the brain is looking for what goes together.
we have a system that in fact does not produce a fair outcome.
The more Afrocentric features a defendant has, the longer the sentence will be.
When we find embarrassing data, are we just going to sweep it under the rug? Or are we going to say, you know what, those are embarrassing facts, but we can do better? Implicit bias is a mental association that we are not aware of that nevertheless influences our actions.
The reason why we call it implicit is because we don't know that our brain is doing it. So our brain is going ahead and making all sorts of conclusions without sending us an announcement.
We're very good at making very quick, snap judgments. We do it all the time. There are judgments about where we are, what we're doing, and where we're going we can make without thinking about. It's part of what makes us smart, but it creates a vulnerability as well.
Implicit bias is about shortcuts. It's about substituting what you think or what you've become accustomed to seeing or believing, and the shortcuts can be a problem.
It sounds crazy that these mental associations might even exist, but there's overwhelming evidence that they do.
I sentenced a guy on a criminal case who was white. From prison, he wrote accusing me of being biased against him. After reviewing my sentencing patterns, I got the epiphany that no, I wasn't biased against white people. I was doing the greater sin. I was biased against my own people.
When I do think about how I'm biased, I think of the fact that, you know, I'm Catholic and I went through 16 years of Catholic education. And so my moral compass is very straight. And when someone would come in front of me, especially if there was some sense that they too were Catholic, I would expect more of them.
My mother died when I was very young, and I was raised by an African-American woman who I considered my second mother. And in my civil rights private practice, I mostly represented African-Americans. So when I took the Harvard Implicit Association test, I was shocked to find out that I had very high implicit biases against African-Americans.
Reaction time measures like the well-known IAT, or the Implicit Association Test, have given us a mountain of social psychological data that's really stunning.
Every judge really should take the Implicit Association Test. It really is an eye-opener.
You sit in front of a computer, basically, and the computer measures the speed at which you respond to stimuli that's sent on the screen. I know it sounds preposterous, but the best way to measure the strength of mental associations is to actually have you respond to images and stimuli on a computer.
I did what any good lawyer or judge would do. I assumed the test was invalid. So I proceeded to spend hours and hours and hours researching the origin of the implicit association test and all the social scientists who have studied it. And in the matter of about a month of really hard study, I figured out the test was absolutely valid.
I think a reasonable skeptical judge can say, hey, even if a quarter of that stuff is true, if there are techniques that I can adopt that allow me to do a better job as a judge and be more fair and square, why wouldn't I do those things? So I think there are three sets of things I want judges to think about. First is mindset. It's really important for all of us to be humble. I know it's hard asking judges to be humble about their decisions, but it's paradoxically only by being humble and recognizing that you are deeply fallible that you can actually become more objective.
You've got the people in front of you. You think you've seen that before. You think you know what the answer of this is. So you have to be sitting in humility at all times, wanting to be taught what is true versus thinking you know what is true.
You've got to be humble. You've got to just own it that we are very good machines, but not perfect. The second thing is slow down. It turns out that if we go really fast, really anxious, and especially if we're in high emotional states, really happy or really angry, those emotional states and this kind of need for speed, this urgency, often leads us to break consistently with our implicit stereotypes.
Judges should be most on guard when they're under pressure to decide quickly.
Slow it down. Slow it down. When you're in the midst of your bias, slow down your evaluation.
Judges, for example, in setting bail, barely see litigants. They're there for a few seconds and then they're gone. It's a difficult environment in which to slow down and make judgments. But the price of moving quickly is probably in excess of reliance on implicit bias.
It is, I think, valuable for you to take a moment, breathe, and slow down, and be mindfully intentional about your equality. The third point is to be internally motivated to be fair and square. There's great evidence that says you might have this bias, but if you're highly motivated to avoid discriminatory behavior, and that motivation doesn't come from external requirements, i.e. you're not worried about the PC police coming down and hitting you on the head, you're not worried about just bad PR, but you actually just want to be fair and square. That internal motivation to want to be fair and square actually does matter a lot.
We recommend self-examination on a case-by-case basis.
You have to ask yourself, what am I noticing and what am I not acknowledging?
What are you assuming about that litigant that may or may not be true?
And what information do I not have? What is missing?
When judges are not paying attention, then we see an influence of race on what the judges are doing.
If I were a judge, I would just do my personal inventory and I might invite others, maybe my clerks, maybe people I'm working with over a period of time, maybe other judges, to say, hey, when you see this, or when you notice a pattern, I'm going to be looking for my own patterns, people who make me nervous. You can feel it inside you sometimes. Why am I having this physical response? What is that about when I don't know this person?
Implicit bias is a bit like an emotional reaction, and you can detect that if you see it happening.
That means I'm going to have to pay very strict attention. I'm going to double down on applying the law. I'm not going to go with my gut. So here's the difficult thing about all of us who've been doing anything for a long time. We love our guts.
We all love our guts, especially lawyers. Lawyers really think they can trust their guts. And what I'm telling you is the best evidence suggests your guts aren't nearly as good as you think they are, especially across social categories of difference.
I have people who will say to me, I can tell who a person is from the minute they walk in, and I'm like, okay, fine, so you got a gut. I'm just going to tell you, your gut is contaminated.
Our guts.
So there's more, and you can check it out on your own if you like. It's a very good video and fairly brief. But the idea is that there are some specific ways that cognitive psychologists have figured out that we can counteract implicit biases. But we're going to do an implicit association test right here and now. And I want to explain to you how it works. It'll be very brief. And we're going to start with insects and flowers. So here's how the exercise works. If you see a word that you associate with insect, I want you to clap your hands. And if you see a word that you associate with flower, I want you to tap. You don't have a table, you can tap your thigh. Okay? So let's do an experiment. You ready? See, clap hands or tap your thighs. Okay, good. So here we go. Okay, now we're going to switch gears a little bit. This time, if you see a word that you associate with unpleasant or insect, I want you to clap your hands. And if you see a word you associate with flower or pleasant, tap your thighs. Ready? Let's do a test. Okay, let's go ahead. You ready? Here we go. Okay. Okay, well done. Yeah, I know. It's getting intense. Okay, now, some of you may know where this is going, because we're going to switch gears now. And this time you're going to clap your hands if you see a word that you associate with insect or pleasant, or flower and unpleasant, tap your thighs. Everyone, let's do an experiment here. Okay, you ready? Good. Okay, you're on it. You ready? Okay, you got the concept? Yeah, let's go back and do that one again. Okay, so it's getting a little harder, right? Okay, let's switch topics here, and we'll do gender. So if you, yes?
Can I ask a question really quickly?
Of course.
Okay, so the thought behind this, so I've taken these before,
Yeah.
and the thought I had was that I feel like it may not be bias as much as like just confusion, right? We have to remember more steps we have past things.
Yes.
So my question is, when they're making these, how do like the people who make them, their implicit bias, because if you do like the race one, for example.
Yeah.
When I took it, it started off with negative words and black people and the positive words, white people, and then it switched.
Right.
So by the time it switches, you're like, I don't know.
Yes, you have the answer to that question? Yes.
So some people start off with black people being associated as good.
Yes.
And others start with black people associated as bad.
Exactly, and there are also confounding variables for any individual test taker. You might be distracted, or you might be more confused that day, or any of a number of factors. So this is not a good test to figure out, do I want to hire this person, or do I want to admit them to our graduate program? It's never been intended to be used in that way. And it may not even be that accurate a reflection of your own biases, though it's been my experience that it does reflect what I sense are biases. The important thing is the aggregate data, which we're going to look at in a moment. But let's do one more version where you're going to clap hands if you see a name or a word that you associate with female, and tap your thighs if it's male. So let's, yeah, okay, good. Okay, good. A few famous names thrown in there. Now, if you see a word or a name that you associate with female and family, clap your hands. Career, male, tap your thighs, okay? Here we go. Let's do a sample. Okay. You ready? Here we go. Okay. I'm working you hard tonight. Now you know where this is going, right? The next stage is if you see a word or name that you associate with female or career, clap your hands. Male, family, tap your thighs. Let's do a sample. Okay, good. Let's dive right in. Okay, finish strong. Now, I did this exercise with a group of people, and one of the people in the group was a young woman who had been raised by her dad. Her dad was a stay-at-home dad. Her mom was the breadwinner in the family. And she was very disturbed to see how hard it was in the clapping and the tapping to associate male with family, even though that was her personal experience. And one of the reasons why I like to do this version of the implicit association test is that you can hear in real time, without any individual person necessarily being outed for having one association or another, what the associations are in the room. And it's particularly ironic, I think, given the fact that one of these two people had a very substantial career, and it wasn't Harry, and it was actually Meghan Markle, because she was very successful. He was living with his parents up until the time they got married. And so it's kind of ironic. Even with them, the association is challenging. So, by the way, if you want to know kind of where you stand with regard to the millions of people who have done this exercise, you can see how strong the association is of male and career and female with family, and how weak the association is in the reverse. Same thing is true, by the way, of the association of male with science and female with liberal arts, almost identical distribution. What about the preference for white people compared with black people? A very similar distribution curve, and I'm going to show you the demographics of who takes the IAT, because that's obviously a significant point here. The preference for straight people as compared with gay people, for able-bodied people as compared with disabled people, for young as opposed to old. I'm embarrassed to say when I took the IAT with regard to age, I found that I was biased against people my age. And thin versus not thin, a similar distribution. What about religion? So Christianity is favored over Judaism. When you match up Christianity with Islam, you get a very similar distribution. And then compare Judaism to Islam, and you get a less strong positive association. And what are the demographics? Well, let's look at kind of how intersectionality plays into this. So I did made my own little chart based on which is the favored characteristic in these pairs that are tested on the IAT. And in the religion category, they have 3 categories, and so you can look at Muslim versus Jewish, or Jewish versus Christian, etc. But one thing that is clear is that if you have won the intersectional lottery on each of these characteristics, you are going to have some advantages in life in terms of how people view you and what kinds of biases you are running up against. Here's the demographics. You can see there have been several million people who've taken the IAT. It's heavily US-centric. 86% of the people who take it are from the United States. You can see the gender distribution, the race distribution, Hispanic versus non-Hispanic. And interestingly, the average age, 27.2, which surprised me. I was much younger than I thought it would be. And so I want to share with you, for those of you who think you might teach this material, I'm not going to show it to you because I think we're very short on time. But this video, which it might be MTV, I'm not sure, is about 5 minutes and shows some people who are about 27 years old taking the IAT, and it makes a very compelling case for wanting to try it. So 7 strategies. I've talked about raising awareness of bias as universal. We've talked about that. Addressing the implications of bias. I think that this is a critical move. And by the way, you'll have access to the slides, but feel free to take pictures of them too. Because one of the dots we have to connect in this field of inquiry is why this is so important. And I've just made a brief selection of material that I think makes the case for why this is so important. So let's just say a word first about the relationship between diversity and power, and also perception. Because the diversity workshops that I took when I was younger we're all about how can we communicate better. But I think the deeper understanding nowadays is that we need to do more learning about diversity and bias because of its implications for power in our society. And this cartoon captures the point, I think. Here's one example of how bias influences the day-to-day life of people of color and men as opposed to women. This study was done in the 1990s, and they sent testers out. You've seen studies, people trying to get a job or people renting an apartment, and the discrimination that people of color face, at least in the United States, and I imagine there are biases in other parts of the world too. This interesting test was, how much do people pay for a car? And each of the testers had the same script to buy an identical car from a dealership. There are many dealerships in Chicago where you could buy such a car. And look what happened. The salespeople, the dealerships, gave the very best deals to the white males and the worst deals to the black females, and then there's a distribution in between. In other words, this is a little tiny window into the way in which race and gender affect the commercial day-to-day life of people in the United States. Let's look at the criminal justice system. If you are black and male, your chance of imprisonment during your lifetime is 1 in 3, 1 in 17 if you're white. The data are virtually identical for white women and black women. And this mass incarceration that we've seen based on race is the subject of Michelle Alexander's excellent book, which is really tracks from slavery through Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and now mass incarceration, the way in which the criminal justice system has been used to oppress people of color. This study from the American Journal of Sociology says that if you want to get a callback for a job application and you are white, and these are identical resumes, except that their names on the resumes are either Afrocentric or Anglo-Saxon. The names are markers for race. And one of the things that that was disclosed was whether there's a criminal record or not. So if you're white and have no criminal record, you have a white name, your chance of getting a callback is 34%. It drops to half if you have a criminal record. Let's look at the callbacks for black job applicants. If you are black and have no criminal record, your chance of getting a callback, 14%, is worse than if you were white and had a criminal record. And if you're black and have a criminal record, your chances are a third yet of that. Yes?
I was worried, this study, they applied the same jobs or the same sector.
Yes, exactly. It was a well-controlled study, or else it wouldn't have been published in the American Journal of Sociology. And when you look at the impact that this kind of discrimination in the workplace has, and this is just, again, one window into it, the kind of bias in hiring, you can better understand why the wealth distribution in the United States is so disparate. Now, these data were collected by the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. This isn't like Huffington Post or AOC or somebody who's got a political point to make. These people are bankers. And what they found was, and by the way, I mentioned AOC because she's someone I deeply respect and admire her agenda, so I hope you didn't hear that as a criticism. But I think that people on the right would discount this chart if it came from someone on the left. It does not come from someone on the left. And it shows that in the metropolitan Boston area, the net worth, the mean net worth of white households is $250,000. And the total assets, a little more than $250,000. In the black community in Boston, the mean household net worth is $700. Now, part of this is a factor of employment opportunities, but a huge part of it comes from the enormous increase in wealth that occurred right after World War II, and as a result of the GI Bill housing benefits went to white people. 98% of the benefits went because the federal government created a system where they basically delegated to the states, and the states delegated to the banks, the decision about who to lend money to. And even those few black soldiers who were able to get GI benefits were not able to buy homes in communities where values went up over the years because they were redlined out of those neighborhoods. So we see this vast disparity in wealth, again, as a result of bias. The maldistribution, the unequal distribution of resources in the United States is rather extreme, even if you disregard race or just focus on the overall wealth. In 2007, 3/4 of all the wealth in the United States was concentrated in the hands of 10% of the people whose net worth, the benchmark for whether you were in the 10% or not, is just under $1 million. Look at the bottom 60%. The 60% of the US population owns 4.2% of the wealth. And in 2015, these figures were updated, and the maldistribution is even worse now than it was then. Let's look at gender. 1 in 5 women has been raped in their lifetime. 1 in 3 have been the victim of intimate partner violence. And when you look at women aged 18 to 25, 87% have been sexually harassed, including 41% touched without permission by a stranger. If you added in people who are not strangers, that 41% would probably double. So the lesson here is, yes, we're paying a lot of attention these days to Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby and Donald Trump and other people who have engaged in criminal misconduct against women, but that is not the whole story. It's an epidemic throughout our society. So in thinking about the implications of bias, one of the exercises that we sometimes do is called an opportunity walk or privilege walk. How many of you are familiar with this exercise? I encourage you to think about doing it with students, and their whole, you can make up your own characteristics for taking a step forward or back. I'm going to show you a brief video of people doing this exercise. I gathered these criteria from my students. I asked them to think about what are some of the factors that you would consider, and then we debrief the exercise. So let's watch again. I think this is BuzzFeed. Watch some young people doing this.
I think privilege is when some people have some things and other people don't have things.
And I feel privilege is something that you don't even really have control over. I think it'd be silly for me to say I don't have a fair amount of privilege, considering like the country I live in and the job I get to do and the college I was allowed to go to.
I suppose being a white male will help me end up somewhere toward the front, but I'll take a few steps back from being gay.
I don't think I'll make it to the front. I think I'll maybe be in the middle. That's just a gut feeling I have.
If your parents work nights and weekends to support your family, take one step back. If you can show affection for your romantic partner in public without fear of ridicule or violence, take one step forward. If you were embarrassed about your clothes or house while growing up, take one step back. If you have ever been diagnosed as having a physical or mental illness or disability, take one step back. If you have ever been bullied or made fun of based on something you can't change, take one step back. If you get time off for your religious holidays, take one step forward. If you came from a supportive family environment, if you can see a doctor whenever you feel the need, if you're able to move through the world without fear of sexual assault, if you took out loans for your education, if there were more than 50 books in your house forever. So these are your final positions.
I think it felt kind of strange for everyone.
It's a hard thing to discuss or even reflect on. It was very awkward. I think when you can represent it so visually like this and so immediately, it definitely takes on a new form.
I think we were like all joking around in the beginning. It was pretty lighthearted, and as soon as the questions started coming in, the mood shifted immediately, and we all it was just silent. Just looking back and seeing like a bunch of people behind you is not a good feeling.
It's like weird how you want to like hold on to explaining a certain privilege. Like,
so again, because of the shortness of time, you can watch the rest of this on your own if you'd like. I've had very moving experiences with my students and with trainees around this. One of my students said, we did this in high school, and we all held hands, and then as some of us stepped back and others stepped forward, we couldn't hold hands anymore, and we dropped that connection, and people started weeping. And so this is an exercise that one has to approach carefully, thinking about the emotional experience that people might have in doing it. And in one of my classes, they said, why don't we do it virtually? And so they did it by checking off boxes on a piece of paper, or you can do it electronically. But it's a vivid, physical reminder of how differently we're situated with respect to characteristics that we didn't choose and that we can't change. Stereotype replacement. This is an interesting idea, and I got the idea from Professor Banaji. I read online that she had scored very badly on her own test. She was biased against people of color, which really upset her. And so she decided to put photographs in her office of people of color that she admired. And she found that doing that changed her score. Now, there may have been other factors that changed her score, but inspired by her example, I decided to put in my office at Boston Law Collaborative photographs of people that we in our office admire, and for a similar purpose. Fourth, individuation and increasing opportunities for connection. So here what we're talking about is the kind of thing that I mentioned with my Five Guys group. Getting to know people three-dimensionally, getting to know their stories, their narratives, their experiences. And so for those of you who are not in such a group, it could be a book group, it could be a support group, it could be a professional group, there's an opportunity to connect with people who are different from us by being intentional about the creation of such groups. Number 5, perspective taking. Life is not long enough for each of us to get into relationship with all the different kinds of people that we would like to know and understand better. Fortunately, there is a vast world of literature out there that can open up our minds and hearts to the experiences that we will never ourselves have. And I introduce my students to and encourage them to read such items as Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me and Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. This book covering is by a gay law professor, Kenji Yoshino. It's a terrific book about hiding our identities. This book, Breathing Room, was written by Patricia Elam Walker, and she came to our co-housing community to talk with us about her book. And so if you have local authors who've written things that you'd like to explore, that's a great way to do it. Number 6. Constructive confrontation. And for this, I'm going to share with you a video, a TED Talk by a disc jockey named Jay Smooth. And he talks about how to talk about race. Let's listen to Jay.
I want to talk a little bit about race tonight. Or to be more precise, I want to talk about how we talk about race. How we engage in race conversations, and how we might get a little bit better at it in some ways. And that's a topic that I have always enjoyed. Most Americans avoid race conversations like the plague, and we often take our ability to avoid it and use it as a measure of our progress and enlightenment, which I think is kind of telling in and of itself.
By the way, as you're listening to Jay talking about race, I would encourage you to also think about talking about anti-Semitism or talking about other kinds of bias, which we sometimes have to interrupt or confront or address.
But I've always been drawn to those conversations and fascinated by them, in part because growing up as a very light-skinned black man of mixed descent, I often find myself in sort of peculiar race-based conversations. Oftentimes when I'm meeting someone for the first time, rather than making small talk, they'll immediately present me with a philosophical conundrum. They will ask, "What are you?" And I'll have to explain, I'm not a philosophy major, my father is black, my mother's white, and what are we? So I've always had a passion for studying and observing how we communicate about race and how we might get a little better at certain aspects of that communication. And I made a video commentary named How to Tell Someone They Sound Racist, which talks about a particular type of race conversation, which usually doesn't involve any explicit racist intent. There's no blatant racism involved. It usually involves well-intentioned people, but it's a situation where one of us feels a need to tell someone that something they said may have had connotations they weren't aware of, or they may have done something that had a hurtful impact that they might not have been aware of. And that's a conversation we all find ourselves in from time to time. And it's a conversation that usually goes horribly. Because no matter how clear you try to be in conveying that you're not attacking the person, you're just trying to offer a specific critique about something that just happened, when we are receiving that sort of critique, we tend to deeply personalize it and take it as a personal attack, and we tend to respond by saying, "Are you saying that I am racist? How could you say I am a good person? Why would you say that I am a racist?" And you try to explain, "I'm talking about the particular thing," and you say, "No, I am not a racist." And what started out as a what you said conversation turns into a what you are conversation, or what I am conversation, which is a dead end that produces nothing except mutual frustration. And you never wind up seeing eye to eye or finding any common ground.
So again, I'm going to cut short a wonderful video, TED Talk, but he uses an analogy which I'll share with you. It's really worth watching the whole thing. He says, it's a little bit like dental hygiene. He said, you wouldn't assume that because you've just had your teeth cleaned that you don't have to use dental floss and clean them from day to day. And the biases that we have are just something we have to work on and be aware of all the time. And as opposed to what he describes as the tonsils model. Like, well, I went to a workshop on implicit bias, so it's sort of like getting your tonsils out. So now I'm not biased anymore. It doesn't work that way. It's more like dental hygiene. By the way, I have a little present for people if you want it. It's a little door prize. It's dental floss, and it says, "Do I have something in my teeth? Anti-racism floss." So, and in addition, there are Black Lives Matter buttons in here, and here, I'll leave it at the door if anyone's interested. In addition to constructive confrontation, I want to share with you one more model or strategy about dealing with bias. And I mentioned the internal family systems model, and it was created by this guy, Dick Schwartz, who's a family systems psychologist. And the word family's there, but it's not really about families. It's about individuals and the family-like relationships that our various parts have. It's all about different parts of us. This is an article, by the way, if you're interested in exploring the way in which the internal family systems model can be used in dispute resolution. You can click there. Part of me wants to help you with your crisis, Hargraves, but part of me wants to go to lunch. Part of me says I need to stop drinking like this, and then I think, don't listen to him, he's drunk. Half of me loves being a pirate, and half of me regrets it. We're very accustomed to thinking about having different parts. Every person in this room, I suspect, had a negotiation, an internal negotiation, this morning. When was your first negotiation of the morning? Time to get up. The alarm clock went off. Right, work out or not work out. And so there's a part of us thinking exercise would do me some good. Another part saying, you really deserve to hit the snooze button and get a little more sleep. So the idea that there are these internal negotiations has now become part of the literature of conflict resolution. These two books, Winning from Within, and Bill Urey, who co-authored the book Getting to Yes, now writes about getting to yes with yourself. How many of you have seen the movie Inside Out? Okay, for those of you who haven't, you've got a little treat in store. We're going to watch a 2-minute trailer because it illustrates vividly the concept of having internal parts. And I'll explain why that's relevant to bias momentarily. This is a little girl, Riley, 11 years old, who's just back from her first day at school, and her parents want to know how things went.
So, how was the first day of school? It was fine, I guess. I don't know. Do you ever look at someone and wonder what is going on inside their head?
Did you guys pick up on that?
Sure did. Something's wrong. We're gonna find out what's happening, but we'll need support. Signal the husband.
Uh-oh, she's looking at us. What did she say?
What? Oh, sorry, sir. No one was listening.
Is it garbage night? We left the toilet seat up. What? What is it, woman? What?
Signal him again.
So, Riley, how was school?
You can't be kidding me.
For this, we gave up that Brazilian helicopter pilot?
School was great, all right?
What was that? I thought you said we were gonna act casual.
Riley, is everything okay?
Sir, she just rolled her eyes at us.
All right, make a show of force. I don't want to have to put the foot down.
No, not the foot.
Riley, I do not like this new attitude.
Oh, I'll show you attitude. No, breathe.
What is your problem? Just leave me alone.
Sir, reporting high levels of sass.
Take it to DEFCON 2.
DEFCON 2.
I don't know where this disrespectful attitude came from.
You want a piece of this, Pops?
Yeah? Well, look.
Prepare the foot.
Keys to safety position. Ready to launch on your command, sir.
Just shut up!
Fire! That's it. Go to your room.
The foot is down. The foot is down.
Good job, gentlemen. That could have been a disaster.
Well, that was a disaster.
Come, fly with me, Gachinha.
So it won an Oscar. It works both on the adult and the kid level. And it illustrates this idea that we have different parts. And it's a very useful concept from the standpoint of dealing with bias. The 5 parts shown in the movie, as you can see, are pretty simple: sadness, disgust, joy, fear, and anger. But we all have many, many, many parts, and including biased parts. Parts of us that as little kids got messages about people different from us that are still in there. We never get rid of these parts, but what we can do is we can heal them, we can cure them. Here's another metaphor. Our internal operating system, sort of like a phone. You've got certain basic functions that come with a phone, and then you've got apps that you create over time, like a dad app. This is my operating system. I have a mediator app. I have a Jewish app. I have a pretty incompetent guitar player app, and some of these other apps, and many screens of them. Percy Ballard is the one who shared with me this metaphor. Screen after screen of different apps. Some of them I try to not access, my shamed parts. If you can fill in this blank in the sentence, I am not blank enough, then you have a part. We all have shamed parts, ways in which we are embarrassed as kids, perhaps, or even as adults. So we have these wounded, ashamed parts, and then when someone pokes one of these parts, like I have a part that if somebody says, you're not doing a very good job in this mediation, that wound, that stirs up a part that fears that I'm not competent, and so my anger part will just pop up all on its own. I don't have to activate it. It's ready to go, which is actually pretty unhelpful. We also have this button down here, home button, which I call, well, which the model, the internal family systems model, creators, Dick Schwartz and other mental health professionals, call self-energy. And it's analogous to spirit or soul. It's that energy inside us that's clear, calm, compassionate, curious, etc., all those good C words. And the goal of this model is to be self-led. So when you have self-energy on board, all these parts can work together in harmony. It's sort of like having a conductor. the self-energy, there are no bad instruments, there are no bad musicians. It's just that if one's playing discordantly loud or too softly or is out of sync, the conductor needs to align the parts and get them working together. So Dick Schwartz wrote this chapter called Dealing with Racism. Should we exorcise or embrace our inner bigots? Now, by embracing, he didn't necessarily mean encourage. What he meant was to get into a curious conversation, like how did I get a bigoted part that has attitudes that are lurking back there about people different from me? Where do those come from? And to get curious and compassionate about the 7-year-old who got that message is a better way than trying to suppress and pound down, because it's sort of like whack-a-mole. You pound it here and it pops up somewhere else. So there's a lot of healing that we can do with this model. And what the internal family systems model says is we all have biased parts, and we also have unbiased idealistic parts. We are all here in this room tonight. We are all here at this institute because we have strong idealistic parts that want to make the world a better place. Shaming our biased parts doesn't heal them. Instead, try understanding them, treating those parts with curiosity and compassion. It's like having a mediator inside and listening to all these parts. And the mediator, this self-energy, can help us learn about our biased parts and help in healing them. So those are the 7 strategies that I offer you. I'm going to, when I send you the slides, you can look at and explore the 7 strategies for dealing with institutional bias. We just don't have time this evening to cover them all because there's one other important topic that I want to cover, which is what does this have to do with anti-Semitism? Now here I'm veering off from something that I teach my students to something that I've been thinking about as a result of being here in Oxford with all of you. And point number 1 has to do with if we want to counteract anti-Semitism, I think it's important that we look at it in the context of all the other kinds of bias that saturate, permeate our society. To single it out as something that is unique, I think, is not the most helpful way to counteract anti-Semitism. Are there certain unique aspects to anti-Semitism? Absolutely. We've heard about them today and previous days. I have 10 minutes and we're going to wrap up. But there are many things that these biases have in common, including some of the things I've covered up to this point. I think that we need to address the core concerns that feed bigotry. Certainly in the talks that we've heard the last couple of days, we've come to understand that anti-Semitism is not about Jewish people, it is about anti-Semites. It is about scapegoating. It's about underlying core concerns of disenfranchisement, disempowerment, isolation of various kinds. If you look at some of the mass killings and look at the individual psychology of the perpetrators, these tend to be people who are isolated, people not getting their core concerns met. And so the saying, no justice, no peace, I think applies to the question of how do we stem the tide of energy that feeds bigotry. Do we want to circle our wagons or build bridges? There are times when circling the wagons is needed, but I think building bridges to other communities of faith, and that too was discussed today about how Jews and Muslims, for example, can support each other along with Christians and people of other faith traditions when hate crimes and hate speech are evident. I believe that we need to resume the work that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King pioneered in building a consensus on spiritual values that cut across religious, racial, cultural, and national lines. The civil rights movement that was present during my growing up included, as I mentioned, my rabbi, members of other faith communities and churches, linking arms, literally and figuratively, with the black community to overcome deep injustices. And by the way, if you look at this picture and some of the other pictures of the march from Montgomery to Selma, what do you notice about the diversity in those photographs? Exactly. So that's why I wanted to include this photograph from the Women's March of 2017. While we are building this movement that is interfaith, that crosses the lines of spiritual connection. And I want to underscore how this work has a spiritual dimension, not just for me, but I know for many of the people at this conference, because I've talked with people at this conference for whom that is a strongly motivating factor, that we need to pay attention to how inclusive we are being as we build that movement. This was my wife Leslie and me with her daughter Sasha and a couple of friends in Washington in January of 2017, trying to shake off the shock of what had just happened the day before when there was an inauguration of someone who I hope will not be in the White House much longer. Allophilia. How many of you have ever heard the term allophilia? So if nothing else, your investment in 2 hours of sitting with me this evening hopefully will be repaid by learning this new word. It was created by a guy named Todd Patinsky because he was concerned about the divisions in our society and wanted to get beyond us versus them. And he was looking for a word that meant the opposite of discrimination. And he couldn't find one in the English language. I mean, being unbiased, being fair, that sort of thing, wasn't the opposite. It was simply the absence of discrimination and bias. And so he created this word, which you can now look up in Wikipedia, allophilia, which means having a positive attitude toward people who are in groups or have identities that are different from our own. And I suspect, strongly suspect, that the people at this institute have a very high representation of allophiliacs, or people who experience allophilia, which means a positive feeling toward people who are different. Mary Rowe, who's an ombudsperson at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was a pioneer in thinking about how to counteract micro-inequities, or what we now call microaggressions, with micro-affirmations. And I think that's a practice that we can all engage in. In other words, affirmatively reaching out to people whom we see in our world being marginalized, mistreated, or disrespected. And so I'm going to share with you the best video that I've seen, which demonstrates a little something about allophilia. And this video was made for release on Valentine's Day. I know we have 5 minutes, so we have just enough time to watch this video. It was filmed in downtown Santa Barbara, California. don't have video. Well, I guess you'll have to watch the rest of this on your own. We have literally 2 minutes, which doesn't leave time for much in the way of questions or reactions. But I think you get the point of the video, which is that if we can see people as having more in common with us than the things that are different, it's one way to bridge to build the bridges. And I want to thank all of you for coming out and staying for this talk. Namaste, y'all. Tikkun Olam. Thank you. I'd be happy to, if it's okay with the tech crew, and I'll stick around till the last person leaves. If something you want to give me feedback on or question, is it okay, Ira? If we take a few questions?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was great. I have a question. I'm studying at Hoffman University at a new program for the studying of modern anti-Semitism, and recently I chose to write a paper about implicit bias and anti-Semitism. And I thought I studied implicit bias, read all I could find about it, and tried to see what did the research show about what I thought would be a minority group just by number, but of course I discovered that minority group is not defined just by number,
right.
But also as the group that currently suffers the highest rate of, and that's in the last years, not just now, suffers the highest numbers of hate crimes in terms of religious, in the set of religious hate crimes, and somehow the research of implicit bias doesn't check bias, or at least from what I could find, doesn't check any bias towards Jews in the United States, and I was wondering maybe you knew something that I don't.
No, I agree with you. If it's there, it's deeply buried. I did look at the implicit association test and took the test with regard to Christianity, Muslim, and Jewish identity, figured out what my own biases were, and the data that I put up on the screen. So it's not that it's being ignored, but it's really just very much an undercurrent.
Why do you think it's not there? Why do you think research completely ignores the most persecuted groups with religious hate crimes?
I'll just, off the top of my head, I'll offer you a very quick response, but I invite others who have theories about this. I think that the resurgence of publicly expressed hatred, which there's been, the data show there's been an increase of that, not just on anti-Semitism, but also racially against members of the LGBTQ community, et cetera. I think that the fact that anti-Semitism has not been studied as much as racism is a result of it being a trailing indicator.
Being a what?
A trailing indicator. In other words, I think there will be more scholars looking at this now that we have an upsurge in hate speech, hate crime, physical attacks, and so forth. But it also, look, let's be candid. If you look at intersectionality and you look at where class, for example, intersects with race and religion and so forth, there are intersectional advantages that I have, notwithstanding the fact that I'm Jewish. And so the course of my life, I've had plenty of privilege and plenty of advantages, whereas there are other intersectional identities in our society where the disadvantages are compounded in ways that create all the effects that we looked at: incarceration, commerce, wealth accumulation, education, housing, and so forth. So I'm sensing that that's not a completely satisfactory answer, and I totally get it as to why that would be unsatisfactory given your focus on implicit bias and anti-Semitism. Love to talk with you more about it and think about research strategies. Yeah.
I think it's important to recognize that this research is coming out of the United States, where the
joining the United States. That's what I wanted to check.
Right.
Oh, that's what I'm saying, because the research on these, the identity, what was the thing called, the test?
The implicit association test?
Because that test came specifically out of the United States, the researchers in the United States are using it because that's, the grassroots movement of research and instrumentation. But it's going to be studying what's most prevalent in the surrounding areas. And in those surrounding areas, we're going to be seeing race, we're going to be seeing gender, and we're going to be seeing sexual identity first, because those are the biggest things that are happening where we are. And so I think that if you could take that into a different region, or into Israel where you are, you're going to be able to see that differently, or see it applied differently. And as you said, a trailing indicator, we're going to start to see this come up. But the bulk of the studies are going to be where the bulk of our issues are found. Not that it's not an issue, it just doesn't.
No, I'm saying I checked it on Jews in the United States. That's what I tried to check.
And that's my answer.
So the Jews in the United States, but yeah.
Yeah, but that's my answer. We see anti-Semitism, but it's not as prevalent, it's not as publicized, let me say that, as racism, and sexual identity. I can't think of my words now, but I think that's why you're not seeing it in the research yet. I think it may even be being developed and has not yet been published in mass.
Yeah.
You may see it increase dramatically as a result of San Diego and Pittsburgh.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have seen it up until now because it's not on anybody's radar.
Right.
It's just not.
Not in America.
I'm getting body language from the back of the room that this conversation isn't being recorded because we don't have a live mic in your hands. But that's, from my standpoint, that's okay. I mean, unless people want to come up and get a mic and be recorded. Other comments, questions, reactions? Yes, Bob.
So, the 1991 study.
Yeah.
Cars. Sales.
Yes.
So, in 1991, when I bought a car, it was only white men selling cars.
Right.
By the time I bought a car years later, I saw black men selling cars. Now, the last car I bought was a black woman.
Yes.
So my guess is, I'm talking about the
Right.
major dealers.
Yep.
My guess is that that study was done again. Those numbers still may have discrepancy, but it won't be that much. And I think it's because the dealers caught on that they needed to have salespeople
Right.
of color.
Yeah. That's a very interesting hypothesis, and if we were betting people, we might bet on your hypothesis there. I can give you one data point, which is that mediators of color, people of color who are in mediations get better outcomes when the mediator is a person of color. And this, there's also, so it would stand to reason that that's also true in the world of commerce. And yet another reason, besides simple justice, for making our world of commerce and other worlds reflect our society. Other comments, questions, reactions? Yes?
Is it better if I stand up?
Up to you.
I'm thinking about the comment that the judge, earlier in one of the judge videos, the
Yes.
black judge, the older black judge, he's commenting, he was surprised to find out we all probably know about internalized racism,
Right.
internalized this and that. I'm curious what you think about when people say that making institutions more diverse doesn't necessarily solve these problems because of these the issue of internalized bias, and also because the ethos and the context of an organization will affect outcomes more than the individual makeup.
Absolutely, and the law is a good example of that, because I think law has been infected by a male ethos. And so women who've entered the profession, and it's only been in recent years that women have been allowed to enter the profession. It's only been in recent years that people of color have been allowed to enter the profession in the United States, and I suspect that's true elsewhere. The norms of how to act get set by the dominant group. And so that's one problem. Another problem is the way internalized bias affects people's performance. You can see that if you tell a woman, an Asian American woman who's about to take a math test, and prime her on the question of what is your race, she'll do better than benchmark on the math test because of an internal stereotype about Asian Americans being good at math. If you prime her instead with a question, what is your gender, she does worse than benchmark. And we all carry around these stereotype threats and the reverse, halo effects. Yes?
I was just going to say something about stereotype, Brandon, but also I think when we look at internalized racism, the minority is more likely to be accused of bias or of leniency bias against their own kind, and sometimes they end up being higher, or they overcorrect, they end up being more biased against their own kind to subject, to overcorrect. It's late, my words aren't coming.
Yeah, no, but that's a very helpful point. Thank you for making that, because if the levers of power are with a dominant group, then you have to be more, vigorous in your judgments or verdicts or sentencing of people of your own group. Yes, Nikki.
I just wanted to share that there's a lot of work at the bar at the moment, barrister as well as mediator, and people want pupillage, they're like hen's teeth, that everyone's desperate to get pupillage. And so the selection process used to be who you know, who your father was, who was the judge, etc. So what's interesting to me is that there's lots of training now. People are taking age off the applications, they're taking names off the applications, but still lots and lots of chambers won't take off the university. So the class of the degree, where it came from, is an absolute open bias that they still want it to do.
Yes.
And that's quite interesting that there's an element of trying to meet an unbiased element one day, and then
And being here in Oxford, I'm getting an education in what it means to have come from a so-called public school as opposed to a state school.
we shouldn't be proud of at all, but it is actually something that is quite prevalent.
And I'll just mention one other point on that score about we all know about the studies with resumes. Some of you put one kind of name on a resume and it gets a different response. So one of the successes in this area is with the auditions for concert musicians, right? Women were not getting positions as in orchestras, and so they started putting up a screen so that people listening to the audition couldn't see the gender. But then they figured out that people could hear high-heeled shoes, and so now they not only are behind a screen, but they take off their shoes, men and women. And now women are nearly 50% of the musicians in orchestras. Now the question is how to apply that principle of blind selection to areas like law, for example, where judgment, interpersonal skills, and so forth need to be assessed in kind of a person-to-person way. And my answer would be there's a lot of initial screening of getting people in the door that you can do with blind techniques to keep discriminatory biases from influencing the choices. Yes?
Yeah, I have a question about, I guess it's also US versus Europe, but taking away from the academic world, because it's true that usually race is mostly discussed in American academia. But I recently lived in the Netherlands, where people still put their photos on their CVs, and pretty much everything that in the US is like a no-no. But yeah, I have to say that in most cases, workspaces were really like very fair in terms of men and women, people of color, white people. It was really, really interesting to see that, because coming from the US, where they're so careful with all these things, I went to the Netherlands, and all of a sudden, actually, everything seemed, of course, there were still discrepancies, but it was much more equal without always having to worry about this thing. So I wonder, why do you think that?
Well, so I was going to ask, that's the very question I was going to ask you. Do you have a hypothesis as to why that's working in the Netherlands when it's not working so well in the US? I see hands, so maybe we...
I was discussing this like a few days ago, and I was saying to somebody that when I got off the plane on the people, I immediately felt the difference between being here, especially in the States. In the States, you walk on the streets, school like this, I feel tokenized. I feel like somebody's watching me, I feel out of place, especially when you sound like this in the South.
Could you talk just a little louder, please?
Yes.
Thanks.
But I was asking the question as to whether the issues that arise because of race has to do with how slavery was done in the States versus how it was done in Europe. And if you look at Britain's history, 1807 Mantua verdict, slavery trade is made abolished in if you look at the fact that you mentioned the persons who benefited from slavery, how they trust themselves,
Yes.
slavery, the concept of slavery had to be imported to Europe.
Yeah.
Because the plantations were way offland in the Caribbean.
Right.
Whereas in the US, the person who you were discriminating against was somebody who you could actually see. So I think that has ramifications centuries later, because it made sure, or it ensured in places like the US that I had to actively hate somebody. Whereas in Europe, it became an important ideology.
Yeah.
Meaning there was no face to the person I'm hating in Europe. Meaning by the time 1807 comes around and black people could freely come to Europe, to places like the UK, and go to places like Holland, Netherlands, and all that, there was no stigmatization. There was no, in one of the things we had to look at in high school was the slave laws in the Caribbean.
Yes.
The Bardinas under the Spanish, the Colonial under the French,
Right.
but it was the British slave laws that were especially cruel. And they would dig holes, put the women inside there, and beat them on the backs to ensure
Yes.
that the babies, their property would become. All of that happened in the West.
Yeah.
The Western Hemisphere, not
Right.
the geopolitical West. And it had a face in the US.
Yeah.
Whereas in Europe it was less. I'm
Yes.
not saying that that's the cause, but I'm saying that it's a question I'm asking myself
Yeah.
and a few of my colleagues in the past few days. If this is the reason why a person of colour isn't a person wearing a turban is quite common in the UK. Could anybody from the US imagine what the reaction would be like if a person of colour just randomly walks on the streets of the US? And as a person of colour, I could perhaps imagine what that would be like, and understand what they could go
Right.
through. But it's just a question I'm asking. It's not something I'm
Yes.
stating definitively, but it's looking at the issue and wondering if this could simply be the cause.
Yes. And I want to underscore your point by saying that even where Harvard University is located, the people that I know who are people of color do not feel like it is a safe place, sadly. There may be a lot of people who have allophilia in Cambridge, and that's where the term was invented. But sadly, the majority, even in these blue states and more liberal
I live
areas.
in Massachusetts, about 2 hours from
Yes.
so,
So, but I think we have our Netherlands answer.
No, I just think
Yeah.
returning, Netherlands is quite unique, obviously, because they also have like Curacao and all the islands. And actually, I just thought about one of my friends, one of my best friends from Curacao. He's disabled and of color, so he's always making jokes about getting everything because of his bias, I guess.
Yeah.
And he's actually in the States now at a conference, and he said that he never felt as black as now. And that was really actually hard to hear, actually, I have to say.
So I'm going to offer two hypotheses. One is that there may be a firmer intentionality in the places that you described in the Netherlands around fairness and racial justice and other kinds of... I sort of wonder whether that may be the case. And also the point about how the United States, unlike the European countries, has had essentially an internalized colony, an internal colony. Lands that fostered slavery, fought for slavery, and therefore had no interest in developing a black middle class because the economic structure of the North was dependent upon agricultural production in the South. And whereas the European countries, the development of a middle class and harvesting, literally and figuratively, the benefit of colonial agricultural production could fuel the class system there. Anyway, I'm not a sociologist, I'm not a historian. I'm sitting in a room full of scholars, many of you know far more about this than I do. So I'm just rambling a bit here. But any other questions, comments, reactions, or concerns before we adjourn?
Thank you, Dave. Just one final question. When I lived in England almost 30 years ago, the society was so much different. in some ways, just my pedestrian interaction with people. I see a lot more folks of color than I did then, and I find social class issues a little bit more gritty here in Oxford. I did not see as many homeless people here. So my question really is going to get to the issue of class, so I want to back into it through a way through a lens that I know that perhaps many Americans do not. And I had an amazing insight into speech here, and accent, when I was here, and was introduced to the notion of the plummy accent, right? And so the whole notion that, there is a notion that, that one of the things I learned is that in a shorthand, speech seemed to work almost like race. That is, the immediacy of speech worked the way the immediacy of race, in quotation marks, worked in the United States. For example, I had friends, and I had a really rare family of friends here who were Afro-Caribbean, were very wealthy, and had gone to the public schools. And of course, the public schools here are what we call private schools, right? And when you go to the public schools, aside from getting, hopefully, a fine education, you also acquire a plummy accent, often. And so one knows, when you open your mouth, that that's a voice of power. And it confused the heck out of a lot of my friends' friends when this was a black family with plummy accents walking around London and coming out of the airport and interacting with people. I saw the difference as soon as they opened their mouths. And it was remarkable to me. So I don't see whether, and I suppose regionality and accent works as well, to a slightly different extent in the U.S. when we look at the prejudice against the Southern accent as, perhaps less refined, less educated, based on all kinds of stereotypes that operate in the United States. So I just want to ask you, where in implicit bias might we have any kind of conversations about what we hear?
Well, I have a reaction, but I noticed Nikki's got her hand up, and she actually has the real answer, whereas mine is going to be very speculative. Go ahead.
I did invite you yesterday at the Love Surrogate to listen to My Fair Lady, and which is, I don't know if you know, My Fair Lady is the story of two guys with a funny accent who are outside the Opera House in London, and there's it's actually Hoffman who's there, and he has a bet that he can make her into a princess and pass her off as a lady as well. But the very first song is, he says, "Look at her, a prisoner of the gutters, condemned by every syllable she utters. By right she should be taken out and hung for the cold-blooded murder of the English tongue." And it goes on to say how when an Englishman opens his mouth, whatever it is, another Englishman will despise it. It's said in rhyme. But it's really interesting that you pick up on that because it's so true. It's an instant cross-check. And you will see people who make the visual assumption, pull back and cross-check as quickly as they leap the horror of getting it wrong because somebody will speak.
Yes. And I observed that here in Oxford. And that is the story. I want you guys, please, all the Weasel teams, watch My Fair Lady if you have.
Yes.
Yeah, it's fabulous.
We were singing it yesterday.
Yes.
I can't really more on it. But let me broaden your point, Carl, and then we'll call it an evening. I think you've put your finger on a good example of how systems of privilege and systems of bias can be invisible to people who are not inside that system. I'll give you an example. One of my students a bunch of years ago was from Scotland, and she spoke with just a lovely Scottish brogue, is that what you call it? And I just, I guess I'm a bit of an Anglophile, I just thought, wow, what a lovely accent. And when we did some group sharing, she said one of her problems as a upcoming lawyer is that she's discriminated against here in the UK because she has a Scottish accent, which is considered to be lower class than the Eton or, plummy accent. This was completely opaque to me. I had no idea all these gradations that you mentioned, Carlton. And so what it does, what you've said, adds a layer of complexity and a layer of cultural learning and cultural competence that all of us need to work on when we work with people from other communities, because they may have their own signifiers. In one of my trainings, a Cambodian American woman said that there is a hierarchy within the Asian American community, and Cambodian Americans are at the bottom of that hierarchy. I did not know that. So we're all learners here. We all have a lot to learn from each other and about each other. Yes?
I think you could also think it in the American context where if you're a black person who speaks properly, you're often described as speaking white.
And which engenders this challenge of code switching and being able to talk in different communities so that you're not rejected for talking one way or another. It's pretty intense. I hear from friends of mine who are people of color, and that's, I take it that's what you're referring to. So, yeah, so the point we were just talking about, there are internalized, within each culture, internalized forms of oppression that we have to be mindful of.
But I really practiced hard, and I love my French, and I thought, and I was good at French, and, you know, did it to degree level. Came to do to a friend of mine who'd been working in Paris, etc., and then I found her. She was saying, "Let me ask for this," because my accent, because I was in the south of France, was Niçoise, because it's more Italian, because it's on the Italian border. So I walked away with French with an Italian accent that the Parisians thought was hilarious. So I would always get nudged to go and do the asking, so they could all sort of, you know, enjoy my accent. So even when you think you don't understand sometimes that you're absorbing and learning and going forward and being judged again in a different language. And
Yeah.
I thought I was pretty good, but there we go.
So I just want to say to all of you, I have to fly back to Boston tomorrow morning. I'm going to miss the rest of the Institute. I'm going to miss out on a lot of conversations that I really wanted to be part of. But I hope you have a terrific rest of the week. And I just think, Carlton, what you and Ira and Charles have done in pulling this together is remarkable. And I hope you have even better and richer learning experiences in the days ahead than you've already had, which would be quite phenomenal. So thank you very much.
Thank you.